Thank you. I will be trying to put these two last talks as well as the previous 2 days of the conference in some even larger context. So, here we are again, tempest-tossed by conflicts between demography and democracy, between individual rights and corporate might, between personal space, social media, and infractions of the global. Here we are again, feeling our way towards some solution, any solution, to that age-old dilemma of the one and the many. There was a decade, a single decade, in which it seemed that the one and the many were finally reconcilable, politically, philosophically, psychologically, environmentally, and subatomically. Between 1917 and 1927, whatever else was going on, the one and the many appeared to have arrived at equitable terms. In the Soviet Socialist Republics and the new Mexican Constitution, in moves toward philosophical holism and Gestalt psychology, in the efflorescence of plant and animal ecology, concurrent with Joseph Grinnell's 1917 exposition of the niche as, quote, the sum of the habitat requirements and behaviors that allow a species to persist and produce offspring. And finally, in the models and mathematics of quantum mechanics, where wave and particle and contending physicists had to make peace with each other, however brief or probabilistic their truce. 4 years later, in 1931, the moment had passed, which we know from the viciousness of the fascisms that took command, from the abandonment of philosophical holism as too easily confused with totalitarianism, and not least from the stubborn resistance of the subatomic world to unified field theory. Virginia Woolf, for her part, fought to keep the one and the many in equitable tandem in her novel, The Waves, through whose 6 characters or voices she explored avenues of self and society, while composing, as Ida Hildgaard has put it, a gestalt about a silent central consciousness. It was a consciousness shaped everywhere by waves. Waves of color, of light, of darkness, of air, the murmur of the waves in the air. That is a wood pigeon breaking cover in the tops of the beech trees. The pigeon beats the air with wooden wings. And above all, in this novel, ocean waves. Waves as she remembered from childhood days on the rocky coast of Cornwall, whose waves are rarely soothing, though they may have come thousands of miles up from Mexico, long waves riding the Gulf current to warm the shores of St. Ives. So in Woolf's novel, the waves concuss as they break on the shore with muffled thuds like logs falling. They pound and threaten. At home, the waves are mile long. On winter nights, we hear them booming. Last Christmas, a man was drowned, sitting alone in his cart. Perpetual, the waves stamp. Like a chained beast, they stamp on the beach, stamp and stamp. They drum and whirl and attack. They fall with a regular thud, with the concussion of horses' hooves on the turf, or like the thud of a great beast stamping. And then they sweep in and out with the energy, the muscularity of an engine which sweeps its force out and in again. They are then, in the novel, a primeval force, a devastating presence, neither mortal nor human, dragging us open like a long wave, like a roll of heavy waters, laying bare the pebbles on the shores of our souls. carried forward by the rhythms of a prose inaccurately called stream of consciousness, The Waves is what I would say as a novel of modern consciousness, a modern consciousness shaped every which way by waves. Waves, I would argue, here on this terrain of infrasound, whose ubiquity at once characterizes and, to an astonishing extent, constitutes our modernity. West and east, we have had particles, atoms, iotas, motes, idiotes, individuals for millennia, infiltrating us like dust, congregating like gnats, or infused like tablets of poison. But waves in most of the current iterations with which you and I are familiar, waves are new, surprisingly new to the last 2 centuries or thereabouts. This may sound off, foolishly off. After all, as we have just been sown, no matter how far we are from the ocean, the earth beneath our feet registers the impact of waves on that distant shore. So whether we live by the shore or in a desert or on a high central plateau, we humans have always been living with waves beside us or beneath our feet. It is our vibrational ground. However, we only learned to define and measure that vibration a few decades ago. About the same time, our radio astronomers claimed to detect residual waves of background radiation left over from the Big Bang. And only now, just now, are we on the verge of decisively detecting those other environing waves that make it possible for our universe to hang together, called gravitational waves. These longest waves, by age, by length, may be our galactic grounding, but they are artifacts of our science and of a modern bent to find waves wherever we look for primal forces. Now, that impulse, I concede, was not entirely absent earlier. Parallel wavy lines, which we find in hieroglyphics, ideograms, cuneiform, had appeared even earlier on Neolithic cave walls, but we do not know what our most distant ancestors meant by them. We do suspect that the most ancient of sailors, fishermen, and coast dwellers may have counted waves, looking for a pattern that would enable them to anticipate the longest wave of each set. In Western folklore, that is either the 7th, the 9th, or the 10th wave. Fluctus decumanus, wrote one beachcombing essayist in 1585, the 10th wave, that is a mighty, huge, violent, and great wave or surge. Speaks a character in the poet Edward Young's drama, The Brothers, in 1753, this fate is thy 10th wave and quite overwhelms me. So, quite early on, waves had seriality, pattern, and power, and the longest waves bore upon humans with the intransigence of destiny. Yet those old worlds of waves were confined by percept and vocabulary to the literal, waves of water, waves on rocks, or to the directly analogical, the waves of tribulation. But the metaphorical expansion of waves up and out of the ocean began in the mid-17th century with a heated debate over the nature of light through prisms. Was light demonstrably refractable, therefore carried by waves, or was light itself a wave, or was light, as Isaac Newton insisted, still particular? Debate over light waves in the field of optics would continue through to the 20th century and perhaps even now. But by then, by the 20th century, waves had acquired such a cultural momentum that despite the photons that Einstein let loose in 1905, by popular demand, light would have to arrive in waves like so much else. So much else? Consider now the lexical, scientific, social scientific, literary, and journalistic arrival into English as often just a few years earlier in German or French, of scores of previously unknown waves between 1832 and 1942. Allow me now to inundate you with all of these waves. 1832, Waves of Sound, from a poem by Tennyson and David Brewster's Letters on Natural Magic. 1833, Wave Theory, from the German Wellentheorie. 1838, solitary waves in fluids. 1838, pulse waves in the arteries. 1839, long waves in the waters of canals. 1843, barometric waves in the atmosphere. 1843, a wave of his hat. 1846, alas, was there no one to bid the waves of passion be still? 1848, waves of vibration and gunnery. 1848, wave motion. 1847 and 1848, waves of prejudice from Tennyson. 1848, a wave of elastic compression, known also as earth waves, producing earthquakes, the first reference in seismology. 1850, the 1,000 waves of wheat, yet again Tennyson. 1851, the wave of democratic equality. 1851, a wave of contraction in the muscles. 1852, waves of population. 1858, waves of time, the novelist George Eliot. 1859, what floods of thought came, wave upon wave, to a character in a novel called The Haunted House. 1862, wave path in the Principles of Seismology. 1863, wave marks, the faint outlinings or curved form on sandstone in geology, as also at the very same time, forced or translation waves, which we now know as tsunamis. 1864, a wave of strong feeling, throwing all the muscles of the body into agitation. 1867, finally, wave fronts. 1871, waves of panic, financial. How do panics occur? Like storms, says E.C.G. Murray. The Credit Parisien had ridden in troubled waters, first encountering small ripples, then little waves, and now these waves were gathering ominously in strength and height, and beyond long lines of surf and rolling mountains of thundering sea. 1876, hot waves or heat waves. 1877, seismic waves, which propagate in all directions through the solid materials of the Earth's crust. So that by 1878, and I'm only half finished, by 1878, the North American Review, speaking of waves, had to resort to etc. Heat waves, light waves, nerve waves, etc. Not the half of it. 1879, wave after wave of the enemy in battle. 1879, ether waves in color theory and in the atmosphere. 1880, wave action on coral reefs in geology. 1881, Helmholtz's wave siren. 1885, the wave of stimulation through nerve fibers. 1886, crested waves of snow. 1887, wave velocity in mechanical engineering. 1889, very long waves in electric current. 1889, a crime wave in Philadelphia. 1890, tricrotic waves in the beating of the heart. 1890, waves of nausea. 1891, price waves in economics. 1893, sine waves. 1893, waves of immigrants. 1896, standing waves. 1897, a train of waves or wave trains in elementary physics. 1901, a cold wave in northern Minnesota and no one knows how long and low the thermometer may go. 1901, permanent waves in hair. 1902, Hertzian waves. 1903, the highest wave of materialism which has ever swept over these shores. 1904, wave meter. 1905, a wave detector or coherer in wireless telegraphy. 1906, gravitational waves of infinite wavelength in Fournier-Dalbé's electron theory. And he says, if we had any means of creating or destroying matter, we could produce gravitational waves. 1907, wave transmission in geology. 1908, traveling waves, as contrasted by our previous speaker with standing waves. 1908, wave filter. 1909, wave period in physics. 1915, radio waves, as in this headline from Cook County, Illinois' Herald magazine, Earth catches radio wave. 1915, a wave of militarism sweeps through the nation. 1921, high-frequency carrier waves for multiplex telephony. 1922, James Joyce, it comes into the picture with natural waves. Gertie's crowning glory was her wealth of wonderful hair. It was dark brown with a natural wave. 1923, a wave band in radio. 1926, a wave group. As in Moore's textbook of intermediate physics, a noise consists of a single wave or a very short wave group, while a musical note consists of a regular succession of similar waves. 1924, wave propagation, also in physics. And Louis de Broglie is able to say in 1924, we are then inclined to admit that any moving body may be accompanied by a wave, and that it is impossible to disjoin motion of body and propagation of wave. 1925, spheroidal wave functions in mathematical physics. 1926, Erwin Schrödinger's very famous wave equation. 1927, alleged suicide waves among young adults or teenagers. 1928, the long wave radiation of bodies at relatively low temperature. 1929, probability waves in physics. 1930, matter waves. 1931, wave analyzers. 1935, alpha waves. Where? In electroencephalograms, that is, in our brains. Following then in 1936, delta waves, also in our brains. 1938, gamma waves, also in our brains at a higher frequency. And in 1938, wave-particle duality. And then, to anticipate World War II, 1939, blast waves, a non-translational shock wave transmitted through the air in considerable distances from an exploding bomb. So that we can arrive in 1940 at what must be obvious to all of you, the wave of the future. By 1942, the Journal of Electronic Engineering could declare, quote, the term wave is commonly used in a very wide sense to cover almost everything from a heat wave to the probability waves of modern physics. And that same year, 1942, first appeared the words sonic waves. The Western world was awash in waves now. Some visible, some invisible, some audible, some inaudible, some sensible, some figments of a fine imagination, some tactile, some highly technical, or purely mathematical. Nowhere to be seen, heard, felt, calculated, or imagined before 1800. By the mid-20th century, these repeating sets of new waves had so flooded the cultural field that waves themselves were granted a singular dynamism, a self-generativity, especially with rogue or freak waves, and hence an explanatory power that became most notable in our relations with many modern media that fed on waves and still do. Question: whence or why this flood of waves? What has driven us in the Western world, if not everywhere else, to regard waves as a, or perhaps the paradigmatic form that force takes within the world? I suspect that waves took on such presence in the 19th and 20th centuries because, during a time of ever swifter speeds of transport and ever-increasing mobility of vast populations uprooted by war, famine, epidemic, genocide, poverty, or climate change, waves oriented people as fully with regard to their origins, as with the pigeons, as to their future. This was the guiding paradox of waves, which few other than physicists, oceanographers, and acousticians entirely appreciate, that waves are at once fixed, transient, and transitive. Except for such forced or traveling waves like tsunamis, waves really do not move. As the Scottish physicist Peter Guthrie Tait wrote about light for the Encyclopedia Britannica in 1882, hoping to persuade its educated lay audience, the essential characteristic of wave motion is that a disturbance of some kind is handed on from one portion of a fluid or solid to another. Handed on, as from one generation to the next, or as buckets from one fire brigade volunteer to the next, from the one to the many. A wave is a figural representation or physical embodiment of this transfer of disturbance or of vibration or of energy. But I'm going to stick with Tait's word disturbance because it best furthers my historian's suspicions. 4, along with the scores of wave phrases I have already listed, other striking wave phrases also entered popular parlance during the 19th century that will help further my argument. Waves of regret, waves of nostalgia, and waves of longing. Welten der Sehnsucht in German. Dating at least to the first volume in 1830 of a magazine edited by novelist Karl Spindler, Vergiss mein nicht, Forget Me Not. Strange as this may seem to us, no one prior suffered what we call waves of longing. Although homesickness, which we associate with debilitating waves of longing, had been closely observed by doctors 2 centuries before during the 30 Years' War, and whatever it was then, and it was severe enough in the 1640s to justify discharge from the army, homesickness was never described, or I suspect even experienced, in terms of waves of longing. Neither the language nor the concept was at the ready to frame homesickness in terms of waves. By the later 19th century, however, waves of regret and waves of longing were in full bore, and they remain to this day tidal. 1861, a time sickness. You mourn for your childhood, and your grief is at first somewhat pleasant because you call up the past, and at least in thought, try to live it over again. But it is gone, and that thought is followed by a heavy wave of regret stealing over the heart. Gottlieb Graubart in Homesickness, 1861. 1880. Music, warmth, and color, all his memories glowed with these, the very life of those born in the sunny south, and his breath came quick, and his eyes filled as a great wave of longing swept over his hungry heart. Bella Italia, Madre mio! 1889, nostalgia. Now that half a century of reforms and railroads has brought about such changes in English life and customs, a great wave of longing and of regret is sweeping over the land for the old order of things which is passing so quickly out of our sight. 1892, passionate longing. Although she had been so undemonstrative while he was there, she had no sooner turned to find him gone then her heart began to beat out in wave upon wave of longing for his presence. 1895, it is the essence of desire. Hiram Minor Stanley, in Studies in the Evolutionary Psychology of Feeling, desire includes as distinct elements: 1, idea of eating as act or movement; 2, idea of the thing eaten as food, a something satisfying; 3, thereupon, the emotion wave of longing, the essential point in desire. By 2010, waves had become a life principle. Quote from Advanced Yoga Practices, Easy Lessons for Ecstatic Living. No one can deny the power of emotional longing when brought into the spiritual arena, particularly when powerful yoga practices are systematically applied within the framework of our spiritual desire, where each feeds the other in ever-expanding waves of longing, mingling with the rise of abiding inner silence and ecstatic conductivity. And in 2015, it was a gamer's spell in World of Warcraft. Waves of longing work at 20 yards. They summon a wave that can do 2,150 to 2,500 nature damage, and they can knock enemies back 5 yards. Now that is what waves of longing do. They knock us back. What waves in general do, the longer the better, is draw us back, as they do recurrently in Woolf's 1931 novel, The Waves. As much as waves appear to be in relentless or restless motion, like many of us, they anchor the living world to its origins, its singularity. Long waves, then, are the reciprocals of waves of longing, for they bespeak recuperable distances of time and space, and some loop between the one and the many. What would be the longest wave? I live in Southern California. So for surfers who scout the world seeking the longest waves, that would be along the ocean, a 2-kilometer Pacific wave off Jicama, Peru. And it would be along a river, the Pororoca River Bore in Brazil, non-stop wave that you can ride for 10 kilometers. But if a wave of any sort is defined by having a crest and a trough, we humans may personally traverse the relatively short, long wave that's rolling from the southern pole to break upon Japan, wrote Bryant in 1850, or the 50 to 70-year-long waves of the Kondratiev economic cycle. But we are in no position to surf the longest waves our universe can produce. To mere mortals, the ups and downs, the crests and troughs of these very longest waves must ever be inferential. Wherefore the current excitement over prospects for firm evidence of gravitational waves hearkening back to the Big Bang, which has left us, as it were, with Raviv and infrasound, something so long and attenuated that is nearly akin to waves of longing mingling with the rise of abiding inner silence, or akin to that wave swelling within Bernard at the end of his life on the last pages of The Waves, where he recalls his youth in order to do battle with death. The last line of The waves broke on the shore. So let us now all hasten to the shore.